I left Ethiopia after years of saving to see my children in Canada. My daughter opened the door, looked me up and down and said, "You're not staying here, there's a shelter down the road." She slammed the door in my face. I slept 2 nights with my bag in the cold, until a kind neighbor took me in. Weeks later, at a block party she hosted to show off her new life, the bank officer arrived with documents. He announced the house was in default and the real owner was me. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The hum of the Boeing 777 was a lullaby, a sound I had dreamed of for 20 years. It was the sound of my life's work, the whirring of my old sewing machines, the clatter of the loom, all distilled into this one powerful forward motion. Outside my small circular window, the world was a blanket of impossible white, clouds stretching to a horizon that held the greatest treasure of my life, my children. My name is Hannah Abe, and for as long as I could remember, my hands had been my life. They were not the soft, manicured hands of the women I saw in magazines. They were working hands, stained with the vibrant indigo and madder of my textile business in Addis Ababa, calloused from decades of weaving the intricate patterns of our ancestors. These hands had built a life, thread by thread, sacrifice by sacrifice. After my beloved husband Daniel was taken from me by a sudden illness, I was left a widow at 42 with 2 young children, Lena and a younger son, Michael. Our world, once filled with his laughter and the scent of the strong coffee he loved, became a quiet, anxious space. I knew I could not give them the world he had dreamed of for them in Ethiopia. The opportunities were elsewhere. So I made a promise to his memory, a silent vow over his grave. I would get them out. I would give them the Western education, the life of safety and limitless potential that he had always spoken of. I sold our small home and moved us into 2 rooms behind my workshop. I poured every burr, every ounce of my energy into my textile business. I worked from before the sun rose, my fingers flying, until long after the moon was high in the sky. I wove traditional gabardine and colorful cottons, selling them to the tourists who thronged the mercado, my reputation for quality and honesty growing with each passing year. Every penny I earned was split in 2, one half for our meager existence, the other half for the Canada Fund. It was a dream, a whisper, then a tangible growing account at the local bank. When Lena was 17, the fund was large enough. I sent her first to a good university in Toronto to study business. 2 years later, Michael followed to study engineering. I packed their bags not just with clothes but with my hopes, my dreams, my entire future. Their tearful goodbyes at Bole International Airport were the hardest and proudest moments of my life. For the next 15 years, my life was the workshop. It was the rhythmic clatter of the loom, the scent of dyes and the brief, precious and increasingly expensive phone calls to Canada. I listened as their accents changed, as they spoke of new friends, new lives, new worlds I could barely imagine. I sent them money for tuition, for rent, for cars, for the clothes they needed to fit in. I celebrated their graduations through a crackling phone line. I saw their first apartments in blurry, emailed photographs. Lena soared in her marketing career. Michael became a successful civil engineer. They were living the dream, my dream, and through it all I kept saving. I denied myself every small luxury. I mended my old clothes, ate simple meals, and worked. The Canada Fund became the Visit Fund. The dream was no longer just to send them away, but to one day follow, to see with my own eyes the lives my hands had woven from so far away. Now, at 62, that day had finally come. Tucked into the worn leather purse on my lap was my passport, a visa I had waited months for, and the last of my savings, a small bundle of Canadian dollars. In my heavy suitcase in the hold were the gifts I had spent a year preparing, a magnificent hand-woven dabi for Lena, intricately embroidered with patterns from her grandmother's village, a hand-carved chess set for Michael, and bags of precious berbera metmaya and the finest coffee beans from Yirgashev, the scents and tastes of a home they had not seen in almost 2 decades. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing our descent into Toronto. I pressed my face against the cold glass of the window. Below me the blanket of clouds parted, revealing a grid of glittering unfamiliar lights. It was Canada. It was the land of my children's success. It was the final destination of a 20-year journey. My heart, which had been so full of quiet, anxious hope, now overflowed with a joy so profound it brought tears to my eyes. The dream was no longer a distant horizon. It was here. The journey from Pearson Airport to Lena's suburban home was a silent, wondrous tour of a new world. The taxi, a large, clean car that smelled faintly of pine air freshener, glided down impossibly wide, smooth highways. Everything was so vast, so orderly, so green. Even in the crisp autumn air, the trees that lined the roads were a riot of red and gold, a painter's palette I had only ever seen in pictures. I gave the driver the address Lina had sent me months ago, an address I had memorized, repeating it to myself like a prayer. As we turned off the main highway and into a series of quiet, winding residential streets, my heart began to beat faster. The houses were magnificent, like palaces from a fairy tale. They were large and stately, built of brick and stone, each one set on a perfect manicured lawn that looked like a carpet of green velvet. There were no fences, no walls, just an open, trusting expanse of property that spoke of a safety and a wealth I had only dreamed of. This was it. This was the success I had worked for. This was the tangible proof that every sacrifice, every lonely night in my small workshop had been worth it. The taxi slowed and pulled up to the curb in front of a beautiful two-story house. It was made of warm red brick, with large welcoming windows and a deep blue door. A massive oak tree, its leaves a brilliant fiery orange, stood sentinel on the front lawn. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the pristine walkway. A small, happy sign of life. "This is it, ma'am," the driver said, his voice kind. I paid him, my hands trembling slightly as I counted out the unfamiliar Canadian dollars. He helped me with my heavy bag, setting it on the pristine sidewalk. I stood there for a moment after he drove away, simply looking. I took in every detail, the cheerful yellow mums blooming in the flower beds, the polished brass house number, the faint comforting wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. This was my daughter's home, a home my life's work had helped to build. My bag felt heavy in my hand, not just with the weight of the gifts inside, but with the weight of 20 years of anticipation. It was a suitcase full of a mother's love. I walked up the pristine concrete walkway, my traditional Ethiopian dress, which I had saved for this very occasion, feeling suddenly very bright and very foreign in this muted, orderly world. My heart was a drum, beating a frantic, joyful rhythm against my ribs. I imagined the scene that was about to unfold. A scene I had played in my mind 1,000 times. Lena would open the door, her face would register a moment of shock, and then it would melt into pure tearful joy. She would throw her arms around me. She would call for her husband, for my grandchildren whom I had only ever seen in photographs. "Imabet is here," she would cry, using the affectionate Amharic for mother. "My mother is here from Ethiopia." We would cry. We would laugh. I would be pulled inside into the warmth of the home I had only ever seen in pictures. I would finally hold my grandchildren. I would give them the gifts I had carried across the world. The scent of my spices, the coffee I would brew, would fill her Canadian kitchen, a small fragrant piece of home in this new land. I reached the deep blue door and pressed the small illuminated button beside it. A gentle musical chime echoed from within. I stood there, my bag at my feet, my heart overflowing with a love and a pride so profound it felt like it might burst. The door, the final barrier between my old life of sacrifice and my new life of reunion, was about to open. The door opened, and for a moment the scene played out exactly as I had dreamed. There was Lena, my daughter. She was more beautiful than any photograph could capture. She was 35 now, a woman, not the 17-year-old girl I had sent away. Her hair was styled in a sharp, elegant bob, her face perfectly made up. She wore a sophisticated silk blouse and tailored trousers, the very picture of the corporate success I had always hoped for her. Her face, for a fraction of a second, registered the shock I had anticipated. Her eyes widened, her mouth fell slightly open. But the joy I was waiting for, the tearful, loving recognition, never came. Instead, the shock on her face curdled, shifting rapidly into something else, something I had never seen before on my daughter's face. A flash of pure, unadulterated horror, quickly followed by a wave of sharp, cold annoyance. Her eyes, which I had dreamed of looking into, did not meet mine. Instead, they did a quick, brutal inventory of my person. They swept from the top of my head, where I wore my hair in traditional braids, down my brightly colored, hand-woven dress, to my sturdy, practical traveling shoes. Her gaze then fell to the heavy, worn suitcase at my feet, the one filled with gifts for her family. Her perfectly shaped lips tightened into a thin, hard line. She looked embarrassed. She looked, "Mother," she said, the word not a cry of joy but a sharp, incredulous and deeply unwelcome question. She spoke in English, the language of her new life, a language that in this moment felt like a wall between us. Lena, my daughter, I said, my own voice a tearful joyous whisper in Amharic. I am here. I am finally here. I took a step forward, my arms open, ready for the embrace I had dreamed of for 20 years. But she held up a hand, a sharp warding-off gesture that stopped me dead. What are you doing here? She hissed, her eyes darting nervously over my shoulder to the quiet, pristine street behind me, to the windows of the neighboring houses. You can't be here. Did you tell me you were coming? I didn't get an email. It was a surprise, I said, my own smile faltering, the joy in my heart beginning to curdle into a cold, sick confusion. I have saved for so long. I wanted to see you, to see my grandchildren. A surprise? She repeated, the words laced with a venomous disbelief. She looked me up and down again, her expression one of utter revulsion. It was the look of a person who has just found something dirty and unpleasant on their pristine doorstep. You can't just show up like this. Look at you. What will the neighbors think? The cruelty of the question, the sheer breathtaking selfishness of it, was like a physical blow. She was not thinking of me, of my 20-year sacrifice, of my arduous journey. She was thinking of her neighbors, of her image. Then she delivered the final, devastating and utterly soul-destroying lines. You are not staying here, she said, her voice a low, vicious whisper, each word a perfectly enunciated drop of poison. There's a shelter down the road, for homeless people. You can go there. Before I could process the monstrousness of what she had just said, before I could even formulate a response, she began to close the door. Lena, please. I begged, my voice breaking, the tears finally coming. But they were not tears of joy, they were tears of pure, uncomprehending shock and pain. My daughter, please. Don't call me that. She said, her face a mask of cold, hard fury. Go away. You are ruining everything. And then, she slammed the door in my face. The solid final thud of the deep blue door echoed in the quiet suburban street. The musical chime which had sounded so welcoming just moments before, now felt like a mocking laugh. I stood there on the pristine welcome mat, my hand still half raised, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The dream, the one I had nurtured for 2 decades, had just died a violent, brutal death on a beautiful manicured doorstep in Canada. For a long time I did not move. I simply stood on the welcome mat, my bag at my feet, and stared at the deep blue door. My mind refused to accept what had just happened. It was a scene so monstrous, so contrary to the fundamental laws of love and family, that it felt unreal, like a waking nightmare. This had to be a mistake. A terrible misunderstanding. Perhaps her husband was a cruel man, and she was afraid of his reaction. Perhaps she was under some terrible stress I couldn't understand. My daughter, the little girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose hair I had braided, whose future I had built with my own 2 hands, could not be this person. She could not. I did not knock again. I could not bear the thought of that door remaining shut, or worse, of her opening it again with that same look of cold fury on her face. And I did not leave. I could not. My entire world, the entire purpose of my 20-year journey was inside that house. To leave would be to accept that it was all for nothing. So I retreated. I picked up my heavy bag, which now felt as if it were filled with stones, and walked back down the pristine concrete walkway. I crossed the quiet, empty street and sat down on a cold, hard park bench that faced the house. The bench was made of metal, and the biting cold of the late autumn Canadian air seemed to seep through my clothes right into my bones. But I barely felt it. The cold that was spreading through my heart was far more profound. From my vantage point on the bench, I had a perfect, heartbreaking view of the life I was not welcome in. I watched as the lights in the house came on, one by one, casting warm golden squares onto the perfect lawn. I saw silhouettes moving behind the large picture window in the living room. I saw the smaller, energetic shapes of my grandchildren, running and playing. I saw the taller silhouette of my daughter moving back and forth, perhaps preparing dinner. The scene was a beautiful, perfect picture of domestic bliss. A happy family, safe and warm in their beautiful home, and I, the woman who had made it all possible, was sitting on a cold bench across the street, an outcast, a ghost haunting the edges of her own dream. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply. A raw, damp wind picked up, rustling the dry golden leaves of the massive oak tree on her lawn. The streetlights came on with a soft, electric hum. I pulled the shawl I had woven myself, the one I had brought for the cool Canadian evenings, tighter around my shoulders. It offered little warmth against the creeping insidious cold. I thought of my small warm rooms behind my workshop in Addis Ababa. I thought of the familiar sounds of my neighborhood, the call to prayer from the nearby mosque, the laughter of children playing in the street, the scent of roasting coffee. It had been a humble life, a life of endless work, but it had not been a lonely life. I had never felt as utterly profoundly alone as I did now, sitting on this bench in this beautiful, wealthy and soul-crushingly cold country. I did not cry. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside me. I just sat, my bag clutched to my chest, and I watched. I watched the life that was supposed to be my reward, my final joyful chapter unfold without me. On the other side of a street, on the other side of a closed door, the first long cold night of my new reality had begun. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that was crisp, bright and achingly beautiful. The autumn leaves on the trees seemed to glow with an inner fire, and the sky was a pale, flawless blue. But the beauty of the scene offered no warmth, no comfort. I had not slept. I had dozed fitfully on the hard, cold bench, my body stiff and aching, my mind a churning sea of grief and confusion. I watched as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Automatic garage doors opened. Expensive cars backed out of driveways. People in sleek athletic wear jogged past, their faces set with a grim determination, their earbuds sealing them off from the world. No one looked at me. I was an invisible, inconvenient fixture in their perfect suburban landscape. At around 8 o'clock, the blue door of my daughter's house opened. My heart gave a painful lurch. Lena emerged, looking chic and professional in a tailored business suit, holding the hands of my two grandchildren. My grandchildren, a boy and a girl, both with my daughter's beautiful dark eyes. They were laughing, their small backpacks bouncing as they walked. They were so close, just across the street, but they were a world away. Lena herded them into a large black SUV, not once glancing in my direction, and drove away. It was then that I first noticed the woman next door. She was in her late 60s with a kind, round face and a cloud of soft white hair. She was standing on her own porch, a floral watering can in her hand, tending to a pot of late-blooming asters. Her name, I would later learn, was Josephine Dubois, but everyone called her Josie. She looked over at Lena's departing car, then her gaze drifted across the street and settled on me. She didn't stare, but I could feel the weight of her quiet, curious observation. I saw a small frown crease her brow, an elderly woman dressed in foreign clothes sitting alone on a park bench at 8 in the morning with a large traveling bag. I knew what she must be thinking. I was an anomaly, a disruption in the orderly pattern of her neighborhood. I quickly looked away, a hot flush of shame washing over me. Hannah Ebobi, a respected business owner in my own community, a woman who had never asked for a handout in her life, was now an object of suspicion, a potential problem to be solved. Josie went back inside, and I spent the day in a state of suspended animation, a lonely sentinel watching an empty house. I had no money for a hotel, no knowledge of this new foreign city. My only landmark in this vast alien world was my daughter's home. I could not bring myself to leave its orbit. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, cool shadows across the perfect lawns, my hope began to curdle into a grim, painful understanding. Lena was not coming back for me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated act of abandonment. The school bus arrived, and my grandchildren tumbled out, their joyful shouts echoing in the quiet air. A few minutes later, Lena's black SUV pulled back into the driveway. The lights in the house came on again, another performance of happy domestic life beginning. And on the porch next door, Josie Dubois appeared again, this time with a pair of pruning shears. She began to deadhead the roses in her front garden, but her attention was not on the flowers. Her gaze kept drifting across the street, to the small huddled figure on the park bench. Her expression was no longer one of simple curiosity. It had deepened into one of profound and growing concern. She saw that I was still there, that I had not moved all day, and she saw the sun setting, and she knew that the temperature was beginning to drop again. She knew that another long, cold night was coming. The second night was colder than the first. A deep, penetrating cold that settled into my bones and made my teeth chatter. The wind had picked up, a mournful sighing sound that whipped the last of the fiery leaves from the trees, leaving them stark and skeletal against the darkening sky. I huddled on the bench, pulling my thin shawl and the extra sweater from my bag around my shoulders, but they were no match for the insidious Canadian chill. Hope, which had been a flickering ember in my heart, had finally died, leaving behind only the cold, hard ash of despair. Lena was not coming. My daughter had thrown me away as easily as one might discard an old, unwanted piece of furniture. The full, monstrous reality of my situation had finally settled in. I was alone, homeless, and invisible in a foreign land. I was shivering, my body racked with a deep, uncontrollable trembling, when I saw a figure emerge from the house next door to Lena's. It was the woman with the white hair. Josie. She was bundled in a thick woolen coat, and she was carrying a large steaming thermos and a heavy-looking plaid blanket. She looked both ways down the empty street, and then with a look of firm, unshakable resolve on her kind face, she crossed the road and walked directly toward me. "Hello," she said, her voice soft and full of a gentle, uncomplicated warmth. "My name is Josie. I live just over there." She gestured with her head toward her own cozy, brightly lit home. "I couldn't help but notice you've been out here for a very long time. It's much too cold for anyone to be sitting out tonight." She didn't wait for my response. She unfolded the thick woolen blanket. It smelled faintly and wonderfully of cedar and lavender, and draped it around my shoulders. The warmth was immediate and profound, a small circle of comfort in the vast cold night. She then unscrewed the top of the thermos, which served as a cup, and poured a stream of steaming, fragrant liquid into it. "I brought you some tea," she said, handing it to me. "It's chamomile, with a little bit of honey. It'll warm you up." My hands were so cold and stiff I could barely hold the cup. She had to steady it for me. I took a sip. The hot, sweet liquid was like a miracle, a shock of life and warmth that seemed to spread through my entire body. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in my eyes. It was not the tea itself, it was the kindness. The simple, unasked-for human kindness from a complete stranger. A kindness that had been so brutally denied to me by my own daughter. Josie sat down on the cold bench beside me, her presence a solid, comforting weight. She did not bombard me with questions. She just sat in a companionable silence, letting me drink my tea, letting the blanket do its work. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" she finally said, her voice gentle. She had noticed my dress, my accent, the very foreignness of my being. I could only nod, my throat thick with unshed tears. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked, her gaze drifting toward Lena's brightly lit house. "My daughter," I whispered. The words a painful admission of my shame. "She lives there." Josie's kind face hardened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something understanding and a deep, righteous anger flashed in her eyes. She had seen me here for 2 days. She had seen Lena coming and going. She was a retired school teacher, a woman who had spent a lifetime observing children and their parents. She knew how to read a situation. She was putting the pieces of my heartbreaking story together. "Has she been expecting you?" Josie asked, her voice still soft but with a new steely edge to it. "No," I admitted, my voice cracking. "It was a surprise." Josie looked at me, huddled under her blanket, a refugee from my own family's cruelty. She looked back at the beautiful, warm, and unwelcoming house across the street, and she made a decision. "Well," she said, her voice full of a sudden no-nonsense authority that I imagined she had used on generations of misbehaving schoolchildren. "That's quite enough of this. You are not spending another minute out here in the cold. You are coming home with me, right now." Before I could protest, she stood up, took the empty cup from my hands, and helped me to my feet. "Come on," she said, her arm a firm, supportive guide. "Let's get you inside." And for the first time in 2 long, cold, and soul-destroying days, I was not alone. A stranger had offered me the sanctuary that my own child had so cruelly denied. Josie's home was everything. My daughter's was not. Where Lena's house was a minimalist landscape of cool grays, whites, and polished chrome, a space that felt more like a corporate showroom than a home. Josie's was a warm, vibrant, and joyful explosion of life. The moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped in the scent of baking bread, of old books, and of the lemon and lavender potpourri that sat in a bowl on the hall table. The walls were a cheerful, sunny yellow, and they were covered not with abstract art, but with framed photographs of laughing children and grandchildren, with framed, charmingly imperfect watercolor paintings, with a lifetime of memories and love. There were books stacked on every available surface. A half-finished knitting project lay on a comfortable, slightly lumpy armchair. A large ginger-colored cat, curled up on a worn Persian rug, opened one lazy eye to appraise me, then went back to sleep. It was a home that was lived in, a home that was loved. It was a sanctuary. Josie led me into her cozy kitchen and sat me down at a small round wooden table. She bustled around, making more tea, cutting a thick slice of the fresh bread I had smelled, and slathering it with butter and homemade jam. She placed it in front of me, a simple perfect offering. "You eat this," she said, her voice full of the gentle but firm authority of a woman who has spent a lifetime nurturing others. "You need to get your strength back." And in the warmth of her kitchen, under the gentle non-judgmental gaze of this kind stranger, the dam of my own carefully controlled composure finally and completely broke. The tears I had been holding back for 2 days, the tears of shock, of grief, of a pain so profound I thought it might kill me, came in a silent, racking flood. I sat at her table and wept, my shoulders shaking, my face buried in my hands. Josie did not say a word. She simply sat down opposite me, pushed the plate of bread a little closer, and waited. She let me grieve. She gave me the gift of her quiet, patient presence, a gift far more valuable than any blanket or cup of tea. When the storm of my sobs finally subsided, leaving me exhausted and hollowed out, I began to talk. The story, the one I had been holding inside like a shard of glass in my heart, came pouring out. I told her everything. I told her about my husband, about the promise I had made to his memory. I told her about my little textile business, about the 20 years of relentless work, of saving every spare bar. I told her about sending my children to this country, about funding their education, their lives, their success. And then I told her the secret, the final crucial piece of the story, the part that made my daughter's cruelty not just an act of personal betrayal, but an act of profound and staggering ingratitude. "The house," I said, my voice a raw whisper. "Lina's house. It is not her house." Josie looked at me, her kind face a mask of confusion. "What do you mean, dear?" "I mean, I bought it," I said, the words a painful admission of a generosity that had been so brutally repaid. 5 years ago, Lana and her husband wanted to buy a home, to have a place for the children to grow up, but the banks would not give them a mortgage. They did not have enough for a down payment. So, I sent the money. I explained how I had liquidated a significant portion of my business savings, a sum that had taken me a lifetime to accumulate, and had wired it to a Canadian bank. "I bought the house for them," I whispered, the shame of my daughter's actions a hot flush on my cheeks. "It was my investment. It was my way of giving them a foundation, a piece of solid ground on which to build their lives. It was a gift of love." Josie stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. The story, which had already been heartbreaking, had just crossed over into the realm of the truly monstrous. Her neighbor was not just a callous, image-obsessed woman who had rejected her own mother. She was a woman who was living in a palace that her mother had paid for, and she had just tried to send its true owner, its benefactor, to a homeless shelter. The pieces were all there. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it formed was one of an ugliness so profound it left even a kind, worldly woman like Josie Dubois completely and utterly speechless. Josie's shock soon gave way to a sharp, teacher-like focus. Her mind, trained to see the details, to understand the structure of a problem, began to probe for the facts. "Anna," she said, her voice now serious, "you need to tell me exactly how this was arranged. The house, the money, everything." So I explained. It had been a complex arrangement, one I had put in place with the help of an international banking advisor years ago. I was a businesswoman, after all. I understood the importance of contracts, of legal structures. My gift had been one of love, but the execution had been one of prudence. "When I decided to buy the house for them," I began, my voice gaining a bit of its old professional confidence as I recounted the details, "I did not simply give Lena the money. That would have been foolish. The money was wired from my bank in Addis Ababa directly to an account I had set up here in Canada. I worked with an officer at the bank, a very helpful man named Mr. Chen. I explained that I had purchased the house outright, a cash purchase, with the money from my own account. There was no mortgage, there was no debt. It was a clean transaction. "And the title deed?" Josie prompted, her eyes sharp. "Whose name is on the deed?" "Mine," I said simply. "Hannah Abe." The bank advised me that this was the most secure way to protect my investment. "The house is legally and entirely mine." Josie let out a low whistle. "Good for you," she murmured. "That was very, very smart." "I thought so," I said with a sad, bitter smile. "I trusted my daughter, of course, but I am not a fool. Business is business." I went on to explain the rest of the arrangement, the part that was meant to be a lesson in responsibility for Lina and her husband. I did not want them to feel like it was a handout, I said. I wanted them to have a sense of ownership, of pride. So I set up a separate account with the bank. An account tied to the property. Lina was to deposit a modest monthly amount into that account. It was not rent. It was a symbolic amount, far, far less than what a mortgage or market rent would have been. It was an amount we both agreed upon. And what was that money for? Josie asked. It was meant to cover the property taxes, I explained, and any minor maintenance. The bank, Mr. Chen, would manage the account, pay the taxes on my behalf, and send me a statement once a year. It was a way for Lina to contribute, to learn financial responsibility, to be a partner in the ownership of her home, even if her name was not on the deed. For the first few years the arrangement had worked perfectly. Lina made the deposits. Mr. Chen paid the taxes. The annual statements showed a healthy, balanced account. It was a symbol of our partnership, of our shared investment in her family's future. But in the last year, I confessed, my voice dropping, things began to change. Her emails became shorter, more infrequent. She stopped mentioning the house, and the last statement from the bank. I did not receive one this year. I assumed it was a postal error. I was planning to come here to see my children, to sort it all out in person. Josie sat back in her chair, a grim, dawning understanding on her face. She saw the full picture now, the legal structure I had so carefully built, the lesson in responsibility I had tried to impart, and the gaping, ominous hole where Lina's payments were supposed to be. Hannah, she said, her voice low and serious. Have you spoken to this Mr. Chen since you arrived? No, I said. I have not spoken to anyone, only to you. Then I think, Josie said, her kind face now a mask of grim righteous resolve, that the first thing we are going to do tomorrow morning is make a phone call to the bank. The next morning I woke up in a strange bed in a strange house, but for the first time since arriving in Canada, I did not feel like a stranger. I felt like a guest. Josie had insisted I take her spare bedroom, a lovely sunlit room filled with books and a comfortable handmade quilt. I had slept a deep, dreamless sleep, the first real rest I had had in days. After a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, Josie placed her landline phone on the kitchen table in front of me. It's time, she said, her voice a firm, supportive anchor. My hands were trembling as I pulled the worn piece of paper from my purse. It held the direct contact information for Mr. David Chen, the senior officer at the bank's mortgage and investments division. He was the man who had helped me set up the entire complex arrangement 5 years ago, the man who was the impartial guardian of my investment. With Josie's encouraging nod, I dialed the number. A polite secretary answered, and I asked for Mr. Chen. When he came on the line, his voice was just as I remembered it, calm, professional, and unflappable. Mr. Chen, hello, this is Hannah Abi calling, from Addis Ababa. Miss Abi, he said, and I could hear the genuine surprise and pleasure in his voice. What a wonderful surprise. I was not aware you were in the country. To what do I owe the pleasure? My voice trembled, but I forced myself to be resolute. I am in the country, Mr. Chen, and I am calling about the property at 2125 Willow Creek Lane. I am afraid there is a problem. I explained the situation, my voice low and heavy with shame. I did not give him the full heartbreaking story of the slammed door and the nights on the bench. I simply stated the facts, as a businesswoman would. I have reason to believe that the financial obligations associated with the property are not being met by the resident, my daughter Lina Tades. I did not receive my annual statement this year, and I am deeply concerned. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by the soft, rapid clicking of a keyboard. I see, he said, his voice now losing its warmth and becoming all business. Let me pull up the file, Ms. Abi. Please hold for one moment. The moment stretched into a minute. Then 2. Josie reached across the table and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. Miss Abi? Mr. Chen's voice came back, and it was now laced with a grave, serious tone. I have the account records in front of me. I am afraid your concerns are more than justified. He proceeded to deliver the cold, hard numerical truth. Lina had not just missed a payment. She had not made a single deposit into the property account in over 6 months. The last payment we received was in April, he explained. As a result, the account has insufficient funds to cover the property tax installments. The property is now in significant default on its tax obligations to the municipality. We have sent 3 registered letters to the residents, addressed to you in care of Ms. Tadesse, informing her of the delinquency. We have received no response. The news was a hammer blow. It was not just an oversight. It was a deliberate, sustained act of negligence. She had been receiving official warnings, legal notices, and had simply ignored them, all while living in the house, enjoying its comforts, secure in the knowledge that I was a world away and would never know. What does this mean, Mr. Chen? I asked, my voice a whisper. It means, he said, his voice now grim, that the property is at risk, Miss A.B. The municipality can and will eventually place a lien on the house, and could even move to seize it in a tax sale. We are not at that stage yet, but the situation is serious. He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep professional breath. As the legal owner of the property, you have several options. You can of course pay the outstanding tax balance yourself to bring the account into good standing. Or, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, given that the resident has violated the financial agreement you put in place, you have the legal right to reclaim your property. The bank can act on your behalf to issue a formal notice of eviction. Eviction. The word was so harsh, so final. To evict my own daughter, but what choice did I have? She had abandoned her responsibility. She had abandoned the property, and she had, in the most brutal way imaginable, abandoned me. Josie, who had been listening to my side of the conversation with a growing look of righteous fury, squeezed my hand again, her message clear. Be strong. My voice, when I spoke, was no longer trembling. It was the voice of Hannah Abe, the businesswoman, the woman who had built a life from nothing, the woman who was not a fool. Mr. Chen, I said, my voice cold and clear as a winter morning, what do you require from me to begin the eviction process? While I was on the phone with Mr. Chen making the most difficult and necessary decision of my life, my daughter Lena was living in a different world entirely. Her universe was not one of defaulted taxes and broken agreements, but of canapes, string quartets, and the precise shade of beige for the linen napkins. The scene shifts to her pristine, open-concept kitchen. Lena is on her laptop, a sleek silver machine, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. Spread across her enormous marble island are fabric swatches, floral samples, and a color-coded, minute-by-minute schedule for an event. She is not a woman worried about her homeless mother. She is a general, planning a major social offensive. She is on the phone with a caterer, her voice a sharp, demanding staccato of corporate efficiency. No, the avocado salsa must be made on site. I want it fresh, and I need to be assured that your servers will be in the all-black uniforms we discussed. This is a very upscale, very brand-conscious crowd. This is Lena's obsession, her first annual summer welcome block party. Never mind that it is autumn. In her mind, this is the event that will finally and irrevocably cement her status in the wealthy, exclusive suburban community she has worked so hard to infiltrate. It is a massive, catered affair, an open house and garden party designed to showcase her beautiful home, her beautiful family, and her impeccable taste. It is, in short, a performance, a carefully curated display of a new life she is desperate to prove she deserves. Her husband, a quiet, amiable man who seems to exist primarily as a handsome accessory to her ambition, wanders in. Honey, have you heard from your mother? He asks, a hint of concern in his voice. Lena does not even look up from her laptop. Who? Oh, her, she says, her voice a dismissive wave of the hand. Don't worry about it, I handled it. Handled it? What does that mean? He presses. She came all the way from Ethiopia. Shouldn't we at least? I mean, I set a boundary, she snaps, her voice sharp with irritation. She can't just show up on my doorstep, unannounced, looking like that. It's not appropriate. I have a life here. A reputation. I told her where the nearest shelter was. The social services in this country are excellent. She'll be fine. She has completely and utterly compartmentalized the monstrousness of her own actions. In her mind, she has not abandoned her mother, she has set a boundary, a therapeutic-sounding justification for an act of profound cruelty. She has reframed her mother's arrival, not as a long-awaited reunion, but as an inconvenient, inappropriate intrusion that threatened her carefully crafted image. The woman who gave her everything has been reduced to a branding problem, a clashing element that needed to be managed. She turns her attention back to her party planning, her mind already moving on to the next crisis. The string quartet, she mutters, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I need to confirm they can play something modern. Vivaldi is so cliché. She is a woman living entirely on the surface. A beautiful, fragile facade built on a foundation of my life's savings. She has no idea that the very ground on which she is planning her grand social triumph is about to be legally and very publicly pulled out from under her. Her focus is on impressing the neighbors, on proving that she belongs. She has no idea that the only opinion that is about to matter is that of a quiet, dignified woman she left shivering on a park bench. The day of the block party arrived. A perfect, brilliant Saturday afternoon. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, and the autumn air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. It was the kind of day that made the wealthy residents of Willow Creek Lane feel smugly satisfied with their life choices. Lena's house and garden were the epicenter of this satisfaction. She had transformed her backyard into a vision of suburban perfection, a living advertisement for the life she so desperately wanted to project. A string quartet, looking slightly out of place in their formal black attire, was set up on the freshly mowed lawn, playing a modern, minimalist piece that provided a sophisticated, unobtrusive soundtrack to the afternoon. A long, beautifully decorated table was laden with food from a high-end catering company, a gourmet taco bar with a dozen different artisanal salsas, delicate hors d'oeuvres, and a magnificent multi-tiered cake from the city's most fashionable bakery. A bartender in a crisp white shirt was mixing signature cocktails at a makeshift bar set up on the stone patio. The guests, a collection of Lena's neighbors and colleagues, were a sea of expensive, casual chic attire. They were doctors, lawyers, executives, the very people Lena aspired to be. They mingled on her perfectly manicured lawn, champagne flutes in hand, their laughter and conversation a low, pleasant hum. And at the center of it all was Lena. She was a radiant, confident hostess, the queen of her castle. She wore a simple but astronomically expensive white linen dress, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile bright and unwavering. She moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, her hand on one person's arm, a shared laugh with another. She was performing the role of her life, the successful, well-liked and perfectly integrated member of the community. "Lena, the house is just beautiful," one neighbor gushed. "You have such incredible taste." "Oh, it's nothing," Lena would reply with a practiced, self-deprecating wave of her hand. "We've just been so lucky to find our dream home in this wonderful neighborhood." She was soaking it all in, the compliments, the admiration, the quiet envy. This was her triumph. This was the proof that she had made it, that she had successfully shed the skin of her humble Ethiopian past, and emerged as a new polished Canadian success story. From my place next door, in the quiet of Josie's living room, I could hear the faint, cheerful music of the string quartet. I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the bursts of laughter. Josie had offered to take me out for the day to spare me the pain of it all, but I had refused. I needed to be here. I needed to bear witness. I looked at my own reflection in Josie's window. I was a ghost, watching a party being held in a house that was in a legal and moral sense my own. A party funded in all likelihood by the very money that should have been used to pay the property taxes. The irony was so bitter it was almost physically painful. Lena was celebrating her new life in my house, surrounded by the new family she had chosen. She had created a beautiful, perfect and utterly false display of success. And the curtain on her performance was about to come crashing down. The party was in full swing. The sun was beginning its slow golden descent, casting long dramatic shadows across the perfect lawn. The champagne was flowing, the music was playing, and Lena was at the peak of her social triumph, laughing at a joke with the head of the neighborhood association. She was completely blissfully absorbed in her performance. It was Josie who saw him first. She was standing by her front window, a silent, watchful sentinel, a cup of tea in her hand. "Hannah," she said, her voice a low, urgent murmur. "He's here." I joined her at the window. A quiet, unremarkable black sedan had pulled up to the curb, not in front of my daughter's house but discreetly a few houses down. A man in a simple, well-tailored dark suit got out. He was holding a handsome but very official-looking leather briefcase. It was Mr. David Chen from the bank. He looked calm, professional, and utterly out of place amidst the casual, celebratory atmosphere of the block party. He did not walk up the main driveway, which was thronged with guests. Instead, he walked calmly down the sidewalk and entered the backyard through the side gate, which Lena had propped open. He moved with a quiet, unobtrusive purpose, a man on a mission, a shark gliding silently into a pool of brightly colored tropical fish. He paused at the edge of the patio, his eyes scanning the crowd. He looked like what he was, a man who did not belong, a man who had not been invited. A few guests cast curious, questioning glances his way. Who was the serious-looking man in the business suit? "Mr. Chen," with the practiced ease of a man who has had to deliver bad news in many different environments, politely intercepted a neighbor who was on his way to the bar. "Excuse me," Mr. Chen said, his voice calm and professional but loud enough to be heard over the string quartet. "I'm looking for the hostess, Miss Lena Tades. Could you please point her out to me?" The neighbor, a portly man in a pink polo shirt, looked Mr. Chen up and down, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Who's asking?" "My name is David Chen," he replied, handing the man a business card. "I'm a senior officer with her bank. I have an urgent financial matter to discuss with her regarding this property." The words urgent financial matter have a unique power in a community like this. A community built on the careful maintenance of financial appearances. The neighbor's expression changed from suspicion to a keen, gossipy interest. He pointed a finger toward the center of the lawn where Lena was holding court. "She's right over there," he said. "The one in the white dress." Mr. Chen nodded his thanks and began to make his way through the crowd. His dark suit a somber, deliberate slash of color against the bright pastels of the party. He was no longer an unobtrusive presence. He was a man with a purpose, and that purpose was now drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. People began to watch him, their conversations faltering. The string quartet, sensing a shift in the mood, trailed off into a discordant silence. Lena, annoyed at the sudden lull in the party's energy, turned to see what the commotion was. She saw Mr. Chen walking directly toward her, his face a mask of polite, unshakable professionalism. She did not recognize him. She just saw a stranger in a suit, a man who was clearly not one of her invited high-status guests. A frown of pure, unadulterated irritation creased her perfect brow. Her perfect party, her flawless performance, was about to be interrupted. Lena intercepted Mr. Chen at the edge of her stone patio, her body language a fortress of barely concealed annoyance. Her smile was gone, replaced by the tight, impatient look of a busy executive whose time is being wasted. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice a sharp, clipped staccato. She did not introduce herself, she did not welcome him. She made it clear that he was an intruder. "Miss Lena Tades?" Mr. Chen asked, his own voice a calm, unflappable counterpoint to her irritation. "Yes," she said. "What is this about?" "This is a private party." By now a small, curious circle of neighbors had begun to form around them, their champagne flutes paused halfway to their lips. They could sense a drama unfolding, a delicious, unexpected break in the monotony of suburban pleasantries. Josie and I were watching from the window, my heart pounding a frantic, nervous rhythm. "My name is David Chen, Miss Tades," he said, handing her his business card. "I am a senior officer with the bank. I'm afraid I have an urgent and time-sensitive financial matter to discuss with you regarding this property." Lena glanced at the card, then back at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning panic. The bank? An urgent financial matter? This was not part of her script for the day. "I think there must be some mistake," she said, her voice losing some of its sharp edge, a hint of uncertainty creeping in. "My finances are in perfect order, and this is hardly the time or the place for such a discussion." She gestured vaguely to the crowd of onlookers, her embarrassment turning to anger. "I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Tades," Mr. Chen said, and he sounded genuinely apologetic, but his resolve was absolute. "However, we have sent 3 registered letters to this address regarding this matter, and have received no response. As the situation has now become critical, a personal notification was deemed necessary." The mention of the registered letters, of her own negligence, caused a flush of color to rise in Lena's cheeks. The curious neighbors leaned in a little closer. This was getting interesting. "What situation?" Lena demanded, her voice a low, furious hiss. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Chen opened his briefcase. "I am here today to act on behalf of the legal owner of this property," he said, his voice calm, clear, and carrying in the sudden profound silence of the backyard. "Due to a severe and prolonged default on the financial obligations tied to this property, specifically the non-payment of property taxes for the last 2 fiscal quarters, the owner has instructed the bank to take immediate action." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. Default, it was a dirty word in this neighborhood, a word that spoke of failure, of an inability to maintain the glossy facade of success. Lena was reeling, her mind clearly struggling to process what was happening. Her perfect party, her grand display of status, was turning into a public spectacle of financial failure. The mask of the gracious hostess was crumbling, revealing the panicked, cornered woman beneath. The public notice had been served. Lena, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning. Public humiliation, drew herself up to her full height. She was a cornered animal, and she came out fighting. Her only weapon, the arrogant assumption of ownership that had been her shield for 5 years. Act on behalf of the owner? She scoffed, her voice a shrill, incredulous laugh that held no humor. You're looking at the owner. This is my house. I don't know what fantasy world you're living in, but I suggest you take your briefcase and get off my property before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing. It was a bold, desperate gambit, an attempt to reassert her authority, to paint Mr. Chen as a confused, incompetent interloper. But she had no idea of the legal fortress that had been built against her. Mr. Chen did not flinch. His calm, professional demeanor did not waver. He simply looked at her with an expression of mild, almost pitying regret. Actually, Miss Tades, he said, his voice still clear and carrying to the now rapt audience of her neighbors, you are mistaken. You are listed in our records only as the resident, the designated party responsible for the property's financial upkeep. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, official-looking document, bound in a pale blue legal cover. It was the official notarized copy of the title deed that I had authorized him to obtain. He held it up, not for her but for the crowd, to see. This is the official title deed for the property at 125 Willow Creek Lane, as registered with the Municipal Land Registry Office, he announced, his voice taking on the formal cadence of a courtroom clerk. The deed lists a sole registered owner. He paused, letting the dramatic weight of the moment settle over the stunned, silent backyard. Luna stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. The sole registered owner of this property, Mr. Chen continued, reading directly from the document, his voice ringing with an irrefutable legal finality, is a Miss Hannah Abbey. A wave of shocked, excited murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Abbey. The name was unfamiliar, foreign. It was most certainly not Tades. Mr. Chen looked up from the document, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of confused, curious faces. We were informed she might be in the vicinity today, he said, his voice a calm, simple statement of fact. The reveal was complete. The bomb had been detonated. Lina's entire performance, her entire claim to this life, this house, this status, had been publicly and legally exposed as a complete and utter fraud. She was not the owner, she was just the resident, a resident who was, as her neighbors were now beginning to realize with a delicious gossipy horror, very, very much in default. The moment hung in the air, thick with a stunned, delicious silence. All eyes were on Lena, who stood frozen on her perfect stone patio, her face a crumbling ruin of shock and public humiliation. The queen had just been dethroned in the middle of her own coronation, and her loyal subjects were watching, mesmerized. Then on cue a new movement rippled through the crowd. Josie Dubois, her kind face a mask of quiet, righteous triumph, stepped forward from the edge of the party, and by her side, walking with a slow, regal and utterly unshakable dignity, was me. I had changed out of the simple clothes I had been wearing. I was now dressed in a stunning traditional Ethiopian gown, a beautiful flowing garment of pure white cotton, intricately embroidered with vibrant threads of gold and blue. It was one of the gifts I had brought for Lena in my heavy bag, a piece of our shared heritage she had rejected. On me, in this moment, it was not a costume, it was armor. It was a declaration of who I was, where I came from and the strength I possessed. I was not a homeless woman, I was not a problem to be hidden, I was Hannah Abbey. A collective gasp went through the crowd of neighbors. The pieces of the puzzle, the ones that had been troubling them for weeks, suddenly and dramatically clicked into place. The strange foreign-looking woman who had been sleeping on the park bench, Lena's cold, dismissive behavior, Josie's quiet, protective kindness. It all made a sudden, shocking kind of sense. We walked through the stunned, parting crowd, Josie and I, and stopped in front of Mr. Chen. I looked at my daughter, at her pale, horrified face, and I felt not a surge of triumph, but a deep, profound and heartbreaking sorrow for the child I had lost. I am Hannah Abbey, I said, my voice quiet but clear and steady, resonating in the silent backyard. Mr. Chen, his face a mask of professional respect, turned to me. Miss Albert, he said with a slight formal bow of his head, as per our conversation and your legal instructions, we are here to act on your behalf. He reached into his briefcase again and produced 2 items. The first was a set of new shiny keys. The second was a sheaf of legal documents, the official notice of eviction. He handed them both to me. These are the new keys to the property, he explained. The locks have been changed this afternoon, and this is the legal notice for the current resident to vacate the premises. I took the keys in my hand. They felt cool, solid, and real. They were the keys to my house. The keys to my life's work. The keys to my future. I stood there, a 62-year-old woman in a traditional Ethiopian dress, holding the keys to a beautiful Canadian house, surrounded by a crowd of stunned, wealthy strangers. The owner had, at long last, come to claim her property. I stood there for a long moment, the cool, solid weight of the keys a comfort in my hand. I looked at the legal documents, the official words that would undo the terrible wrong that had been done to me. Then I looked at my daughter. Lena was a statue of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her perfect party was in ruins. Her carefully constructed image was shattered. Her public triumph had become a spectacle of her own profound and very public disgrace. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred, fear, and a dawning terrible understanding of the consequences of her own cruelty. I took a step toward her. I did not shout. I did not cry. My voice when I spoke was not filled with rage or with triumph. It was filled only with a deep and final heartbreaking authority. The authority of a mother who has been pushed too far. The authority of a businesswoman whose contract has been violated. The authority of the legal owner of the property on which she stood. Linda, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the profound silence of the backyard, I believe you are trespassing. The word so formal, so legal, was a final brutal severing of the maternal bond between us. I was no longer speaking to her as a mother. I was speaking to her as a landowner. Addressing an illegal occupant, I have been advised by the bank that you have 30 days to gather your personal belongings and leave my house, I continued, my voice still calm, still even. But your party is over, now. I then turned, no longer looking at her, and faced the stunned, silent crowd of her neighbors, the very people she had been so desperate to impress. I raised my voice slightly, so they could all hear. I want to thank you all for coming today, I said, a faint, sad smile on my face. My daughter has been a guest in my home for 5 years, but it is time now for her to find a home of her own. The party is over. Please, go home. For a moment, no one moved. They were all frozen, caught in the middle of this unbelievable real-life drama. Then from the edge of the crowd, a single sharp sound cut through the silence. It was Josie. She was clapping, a single sharp and utterly defiant clap. Then, another neighbor, the portly man in the pink polo shirt who had first spoken to Mr. Chen, began to clap as well. Then another, and another. A wave of spontaneous applause began to spread through the crowd. They were not applauding for the drama. They were not applauding for Lena's downfall. They were applauding for me. They were applauding for the quiet, dignified woman who had been wronged. The woman who had slept on a bench while her daughter lived in a palace. The mother who had finally, and with a devastating, quiet grace, reclaimed her home and her dignity. The sound of their applause, a sound of support from a community that did not even know me, washed over me. Lena stood, frozen, in the middle of her ruined party. Her face a mask of pure and adulterated humiliation, forced to listen to the sound of her own social circle applauding her eviction. I turned my back on her, on the party, on the entire ugly mess. I took Josie's arm, and together we walked away from the stunned crowd, in the string quartet. We walked across the perfect lawn, through the side gate, and toward the front of the house. My house. I walked up the pristine walkway, the same one I had walked down in despair just weeks ago. I reached the deep blue door, the one that had been slammed in my face. I took out my new key, slid it into the lock, and turned. The door opened, and I walked inside. I was finally home.